Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is a panel on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we are going to think about this topic broadly and think about all sorts of implications the Ukrainian society is currently facing. So first, let me tell you how it is going to work today. So first of all, we will start by allowing our panelists to have 10 minutes for their opening remarks. Then I will be introducing each panelist as we go, so that you know who is currently speaking. After the opening remarks, we will have our discussion. Obviously, we will start with questions from the live audience, and I will probably read out loud questions from the chat on Zoom. However, this is not a webinar, this is like an actual Zoom call. So those audience members who are online, they can actually unmute themselves and ask questions, and we'll all hear them here on the big screen. So please remember that there is both like an option to ask your question or to put it into the chat. We are scheduled today to go for an hour and a half, and we will finish by 2 p.m. Eastern. So today we'll discuss the effects of the Russian invasion on Ukrainian society from political, historical, and economic perspective. So I asked panelists to think very broadly about their research that they conducted both before the full-scale invasion and after it. And I asked them to talk about their findings and how these findings might have been changed by what we have been observing for the last year and a half. We also will discuss the response within the Ukrainian society, and probably, based on your questions, also in the international community. And I want you all to think about very wide political and socio-economic implications for Ukraine and Russia. Finally, I invite everybody to think about the potential post-war scenarios, including but not limited to recovery and reconstruction, as well as long-term demographic, economic, and political changes in Ukraine. So it is a great honor to have our panelists here today. And I have a ton of questions I want you to ask, but obviously the audience will go first. But before that, let me introduce our first panelist, Alexandra Kudel, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Public Policy and Governance at Kyiv School of Economics. In her research, she focuses on local democracy, social movements and civil engagement, as well as business political arrangements at the local level in Ukraine. Dr. Kudel is also a consultant on open government, anti-corruption policies, and public integrity for international organizations. She is a member of German-Ukrainian Academic Society. And today, Dr. Kudel will kick off our discussion with her study on the contribution of local authorities to the resilience of Ukraine and about decentralization in Ukraine more broadly. Thank you very much, and
well, thank you very much, Anastasia, for the invitation and for the chance to talk about the resilience of local authorities in this setting. And let me start by highlighting that there has been a massive asymmetry in the military and financial means between Russia and Ukraine when Russia attacked. And we saw a really amazing mobilization of the Ukrainian society. But what often remains somehow taken for granted is actually the Ukrainian statehood is also resilient. That is something, considering that there has been the post-Soviet legacies and considering that the state building was also a bit bumpy. It is quite puzzling that the statehood of Ukraine is operating relatively well, considering the amount of the threat and the size of the threat. And so I would like to try to relate to this puzzling resilience of the statehood by capturing the coping practices of the Ukrainian local authorities. And I will do that based on a survey which we conducted together with Oksana Hus, who is my co-author. We did it for the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe and in partnership with the Association of Ukrainian Cities. And so the survey, which I'm talking about, captured the responses from 241 Ukrainian municipalities. That's actually a lot. That's about 17% of all the municipalities in Ukraine. And most of them are rural and urban municipalities of 50,000 people and less. That is small by Ukrainian standards. So you could say that these are not the most resourceful big cities, but rather small municipalities. And still you will see how interesting from the democratic resilience point of view, their coping practices are. So in this remarks, I will argue that Ukraine has been moving in general to the collaborative democracy as a way of organizing citizen-state relations, and that it is based on the expectation of partnership between the local or between the authorities and the citizens. And by underscoring the democratic resilience, we find that in our survey that more than 80% of the local municipalities were basing their emergency response on the decisions of the legitimate local institutions, the collective, collegial decision-making institutions. And we also find the resilience is that about 72% provide the administrative services, almost all of them in full. It was already 2-3 weeks into the full-scale invasion. And we find that at the time of the survey, the citizen trust to the municipalities was also very, very high. 63% to mayors is a lot, because we know that before the full-scale invasion was about 48%. And so I would like to say that the 3 parallel developments have likely contributed to both the resilience in general and the collaborative nature of the Ukrainian resilience at the local level. So first, I would like to know that there has been a multi-level governance reform. It was also known as a decentralization reform. And the idea is that since 2015, Ukrainian municipalities were reorganized into larger units. It's called amalgamation, and they had better prerequisites for efficiency in providing the public services like education and primary healthcare. Then they also received fiscal autonomy, whereby they had more share in the local taxes, which came directly to their budgets. And this made them, coupled with these increased competences, local authorities became the go-to legitimate points at the local level. And the reform empowered local municipalities to sort of self-organize based on their needs and local context. Another important development that has been going on is the digital transformation. It was going not just open data that has been booming in Ukraine, but also e-governance made receiving administrative services not just more efficient, but it has become more dignified, because people were they had this no direct contact with the local authorities. There were lack opportunities for extortion or other negative experiences, and instead it is an easy way of receiving your services. You can register a baby newborn without exiting your house. Then there were also the digitalization brought the geoinformation systems and budget dashboards that were presenting the data in a very easy to understand format. And that makes it also, the local authority becomes not a black box, but rather a more transparent, understandable entity. And the third development, which I want to highlight, is the participatory turn in local government. So increased autonomy, better broadened competences, and the digital transformation. This all created the prerequisites for collaborative governance to be developing at the local level. And there were some tools like participatory budget introduced. In 2021, just in 1 year, 1.2 million Ukrainians participated in selecting projects which will be implemented by local authority. And these projects have been designed by the citizens themselves. So you can imagine how much local ownership this creates when people can decide on what is needed. But now when Russia attacked Ukraine, Ukraine had to introduce the martial law, and martial law creates limits to the standard democratic accountability mechanism. So you cannot withdraw your local deputy anymore, although you used to be able to do. Also, direct democracy mechanisms like local referenda, they are suspended. Transparency requirements have been also reduced, and there are also prerequisites for mayors to act single-handedly on certain aspects. So you would think that this all limits the democraticness of the relationships between the citizen and the state, yet we see that the collaborative trends were able to at least partially compensate for the lack of the traditional accountability mechanisms, as we see the trust numbers are actually quite high. So having said that, I would like to move to the coping practices of Ukrainian local authorities. How do they cope with the challenges? And we find that they use participatory approach to meet the needs of the local and newly arriving people, the internally displaced people, and solve other crises that are related to war. So on this slide, you will see the specific purposes for which local authorities have engaged publics after the 24th of April. As we see with blue, these are more pragmatic purposes. So coordination of supply and demand for help, coordination of volunteers, and attracting external resources. Here, note how local authorities realize they cannot possibly solve the crises alone. They understand that the people around them have the resources and the knowledge, and they rather work as coordinators. Then in the yellow, you see what we call so good governance purposes. So increasing community trust is very important for them, and anti-corruption and inclusion of diverse opinions are also relevant goals. I would just stop on the anti-corruption goal because it is related to trust. They understand that people are very sensitive to corruption and proactively, for example, open information about humanitarian aid that comes into their municipality and show pictures and how people receive this aid. And in the green, you can see purposes which we understand more like a community well-being, strengthening community cohesion, meeting the needs of vulnerable social groups. It's amazing that for all these goals, the local authority uses the input of the publics. So I will just highlight one more example, which I find really inspiring. Is in Lviv, there is an IT cluster, which is an organization of the IT businesses. The local authority is also part of it, and universities that prepare IT specialists. And they are having a volunteer project, which means it's not a service that you do, but rather it is their volunteer initiative to technically support the air defense of the whole Western region. For example, they develop software for training of people to do the Javelin style air defense. And this kind of partnership goes beyond what we know in the West as service provision. This is really co-creation and co-production of this solution to the new crisis. Also, I would like to note one more thing is that we have an opportunity to compare some of the purposes with the 2021 similar survey, and we see that attracting external resources has grown really a lot, which again sees that this co-production moving towards co-production, and we see that anti-corruption has increased also, showing that local authorities are well aware and sensitive to the demands of the Ukrainian people for integrity. This we have to take account when we do the recovery institutional framework, is that it is also an issue it is also something to a lot of people worried about corruption, and then we understand that the local authorities can be this meaningful tool of how to enable integrity in the use also of the recovery funding. And we see that engagement of direct stakeholders to problem solving has also increased, suggesting that local authorities can be working as amplifiers of all the local self-organization potential. And here on this slide, one thing I wanted to rather highlight is that local business has increased its participation in all levels of possible participation. For example, we see here increase in that business takes part in implementation of different solutions to the problems. This is also something to keep in mind for the recovery, is that there is connections that are being built already during the war, which can be used in order to ensure the recovery that is more participatory and builds on the, again, local resources and local potentials. I also want to highlight two other aspects of how decentralized governance and the increased autonomy of local authorities is now helping in the crisis. There were several pre-existing practices that they have developed, which are now helping them to tackle the crisis. One is intermunicipal collaboration. This has been really crucial. So local authorities, through their associations and through direct partnerships with the communities and even with partnerships with international, with the municipalities in other European states, they are helping each other to meet humanitarian needs and, for example, with generators or any other aspects of the crisis response. And finally, there is also the use of digital tools has been very helpful to, for example, to inform people about the dangers and or threats at the local level, and to decrease the misinformation that is also a part of this work. And we see the chatbots, and here also some social media channels that is used for coordination at the local level. To summarize, what we see is that Ukrainian municipalities actually practice collaborative crisis response, and it supports the legitimacy of these authorities in the Ukrainian decentralized state, which is informative of how to arrange security without losing a democracy. Second point is that we see that citizens are viewed as partners and not just as clients. And we think it is a way of building a new social contract in Ukraine, which is based on increasing collaborative democracy trends. And when we think about what is needed for the recovery, then we see that decentralization reform has been an important framework condition for developing of these collaborative democratic trends. That's why completion of this reform and respecting subsidiarity principle during the recovery is crucial to sustain Ukraine, not just as a resilient, but also a democratic state. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. It is truly an inspiring thought to know that an administrative reform that happened just years before the full-scale invasion actually makes Ukrainians more resilient at the time of war. So now we'll turn to Emma Mateo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Harman Institute at Columbia University. Emma studies protest and activism in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Her research focuses on local mobilization during mass protests and significant political events. Dr. Mateo also studies how media and technology interact with protest and civil society mobilization, and her work makes innovative use of social media data. At the Harman Institute, Emma works on a project examining grassroots community responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So now I turn the floor over to you. Please welcome Emma.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to share some of my doctoral research about regional protest in Ukraine during mass mobilization. I was finishing this up about a year ago. And the full-scale invasion hasn't really changed this research itself, but I think it has shown that this context is incredibly important, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So I was not surprised when Ukraine did not fall to Russian forces within a few days, as many people predicted, wrongly, of course. And this wasn't based on some comprehensive understanding of the relative military strengths and tactics and things like that. I know very little about the military. This is based on studying Ukrainian civil society and activism and protest over a longer period And Ukraine is really a country with a long and strong history of activism and organization and protest. And it's within this context that we should understand Ukrainian resistance today. And I argue that it shouldn't, the way Ukraine has reacted today, not in terms of just military resistance, but particularly the role civilians have played, we shouldn't really be surprised if we understand this longer context. So my slide's not as beautiful as Alexandra's. I'm going to share with you a few maps and talk more generally. And just a word on my methods and a little bit of a caveat. So these maps are based on protest event analysis that I conducted using a variety of sources, and these vary a little bit from protest to protest. I'm not going to go super in-depth on my methods. I'm happy to answer questions on this if people are interested. I will just flag that for the Revolution on Granite protests in 1990 that I'm going to talk about, I've used KGB reports and news wires by an activist organization, because obviously media was not free and publishing pro-independence protests at that time. And also the nature of protest event analysis using media sources means that we may have a tendency to miss some smaller or regional protest events. So these maps I'm going to show you, these are the absolute minimum protests that took place across the country. I'll be perfectly transparent and say I'm probably missing a few things that took place in smaller towns and cities. But nonetheless, I think these are going to be interesting for our discussion today. So the Revolution on Granite were protests that took place in the fall of 1990 when Ukraine was still a Soviet republic. To preface these a little bit, there were more democratic elections to the Ukrainian parliament in 1990, where the democratic opposition bloc managed to gain some seats. And then this kind of triggered a bit of a wave of demands for Ukraine to take further steps towards independence. So the main kind of claims of these protests were for the declaration of Ukraine's sovereignty to be enshrined in law, to end overseas military service for young Ukrainian men, and to depoliticize the police and security forces, and in particular to say no to a new signing of the Union Treaty with the USSR. And protests began in September throughout Ukraine. These September protests were mostly organized by Ruch, which was a movement for greater Ukrainian democracy and independence. And Ruch organized a number of protests throughout Ukraine. As you can see, I've kept the map simple here. I'm not showing differences in size. This is over the period of September and October, all the places that mobilized. And essentially, protests took place throughout the country, fairly small scale. In September, on the 1st of October, there was a rally of 100,000 people in Kiev. And then the following day, students began a hunger strike on what's now called Independence Square in Kiev, although at the time, of course, it did not have that name. And we really saw an effort by the students and by the kind of old school dissidents to try and coordinate things across the country, to make contacts with the miners, and to really mobilize outside of the capital city in Western Ukraine. Of course, at this time, the internet wasn't a thing. It was a lot harder to get information out. So people were physically going out into the regions to speak to people. And already we can see, these protests are not only taking place in Kiev, they're throughout the country, including in the south and east, where we might not expect it at this time. And the students and the protesters did achieve their aims and kind of put Ukraine on a path to greater independence that then would be finally granted in 91. And then the next, I haven't gone into detail on the miners' protest with my research, because these are more restricted to a part of the country and a specific kind of grievances, but I just want to acknowledge that there were large miners' protests in the intervening period between 1990 and 2000. But the next protests I'm going to talk about are the Ukraine Without Kuchma protests that happened in the winter of 2000 to 2001. Kuchma had just won his second term. He was re-elected in 1990, but things were not going particularly well. There were a lot of accusations of democratic backsliding. And then in the fall, leaks were released implicating him in all sorts of nasty things, corruption, persecution of opposition, activists and journalists, and particularly the kidnapping and murder of Gyuri Gongadze, the famous independent journalist. So tents were set up in Kiev on the 15th of December 2000. And then we see two waves of protest across the country, kind of pre and then post New Year. Actors from across the political spectrum participated in this, which is particularly interesting. We have sometimes within the same city, you have members of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the Greens, like more nationalist organizations. So this was really kind of like across boundaries. Everyone was united by this desire to get rid of Kuchma. And that kind of facilitated the expansion of protests into more regions, particularly in central Ukraine, although my data indicates that on the whole, perhaps not quite as many localities mobilized during Ukraine without Kuchma protests. Eventually, these protests kind of faded away into the spring without really achieving their aims, which is potentially as a result of difficulties coordinating such like a broad spectrum of actors, right? Particularly when radical right actors started using more violent methods. There was a disagreement about how to deal with this, and the government was able to exploit this to violently repress the protests, and things kind of fizzled out. But nonetheless, the Ukraine without Kuchma set some important groundwork, connected some different actors and organizations, and enabled some lessons to be learned in advance of the Orange Revolution, which happened a few years later. I'm not going to go into details too much about the causes of the Orange Revolution. I think people are probably a bit more familiar, essentially falsified elections, which wrongly declared Yanukovych the victor. And a lot of both academic and more like popular and journalistic reports really focused on what was happening in Kiev during the Orange Revolution. And of course, these were the site of the largest protests, but there were also protests throughout Ukraine during the period of the Orange Revolution, which I think gets less attention. Every single regional capital mobilized, as well as smaller cities, particularly in central and western Ukraine. And of course, the protests were larger and more frequent in Kiev and in western Ukraine, but nonetheless, we're seeing mobilization throughout the country. And this included at some point in Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa, there were protests of 10,000 plus people. So these are not insignificant mobilizations taking place throughout Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. And over 35 cities mobilized overall. And then if we move forward to the Euromaidan protest, my map looks a little bit different because this is from a different paper. At least 63 locations mobilized throughout Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. Again, Kiev was the site of the largest protests, probably the most significant protest because of course the seat of the government is there. But this was a nationwide protest movement from the very first day. At least 9 cities mobilized on the 21st of November, the day that President Yanukovych said he wasn't going to sign the association agreement with the EU. And then if you look at the white dots, 22 out of 24 oblast capitals mobilized before the beating of the students. So there was widespread protest even before this became about much more than the association agreement. A lot of cities were seeing smaller protests when this was really just focusing on like moving more towards the EU, right? But then on the 30th of November, as overnight, as many of us know, the peaceful protesters on the central square in Kiev were beaten, and then the grievances of the protest shift, and this became a lot more about seeking freedom and independence and democracy in Ukraine and pushing back against authoritarian rule by President Yanukovych. So the protests became a lot bigger and more diverse, taking place in more locations. And over that winter, November, December, January, February, as I said, 63 localities protested. So what does all this mean for today? This means that, you know, Ukraine, even over the last 30 years, has a lively history of activism and protest. And all of these movements have been contributing to the development of activists and NGO networks. They've been an opportunity for people to develop skills in organizing, perhaps a sense of efficacy of being able to change something. And they show that Ukraine has a history of pushing for democracy and freedom. All of this makes it less surprising when we see research about the context of civilian mobilization in the war. Olga Onuk and her colleagues at the Mobilize Project ran recent surveys which suggested in February, 80% of the Ukrainian population is engaged in the war effort in some way. Now, of course, that's not protesting. That looks very different than it did during the Euromaidan, but this is civilian participation in Ukraine's effort to gain independence. And in a way, this makes sense. The full-scale invasion is an extremely unifying event, more so than these protests I've talked about, which still had a partisan partisan element. But it's important to understand Ukraine's history of resistance and understanding what's happening today. And in terms of future implications, I would just echo Alexandra in saying that it's really important that Ukrainian society and civil society is brought along in thinking about future reconstruction and continued reform in Ukraine. Ukraine has this extraordinarily powerful society, which has a lot of will and capacity to keep moving the country forward and hold the government accountable. And we need to make sure that this, people power is tapped into what Ukraine's thinking about reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ukrainian society has a ton of experience resisting authoritarian forces, and this experience came in handy last February. So thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Arturas Rosenas, who is an associate professor here at NYU at the Department of Politics. His research primarily focuses on authoritarian politics, the causes and consequences of state repression, information manipulation through media, propaganda, and elections, and the historical development of political institutions. Dr. Rosenas is currently working on a book project on the role of mass politics in dictatorship and democracy. And Arturas Rosenas has published a ton of research on Ukraine. I highly encourage all of you to go and read this big biography. And so please welcome Arturas Rosenas.
Thank you, Anastasia. So yeah, I wrote many papers about Ukraine, but today I'm not going to be talking about any of those papers specifically. Let me look at the other side of the equation here. And the question I would like to raise here, and I would like to discuss on the basis of my previous research is, in what sense does it matter that in this war, Russia is a coercive dictatorial state? In what sense does it matter? And I'm not going to answer this question directly by studying what Russia is doing now, but I'm going to be studying or presenting findings from the research that where we build an analogy. So particular research that I have in mind that we started about 5 years ago is a paper called Fighting for Tyranny, and that is co-authored with Roda Teribova, who is now at Vanderbilt University, and Yuri Zhukov, who's at the University of Michigan. And so the idea of this particular paper was to look at the historical link between the Great Terror Campaign conducted by Stalin in the 1930s and the military effort of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War as we know it more widely. Right, so the idea was to sort of try to understand and to what degree did it actually matter for the mobilization of the population, for the behavior of individual soldiers on a battlefield, that they are actually fighting for a country that is at that time, of course, was very dictatorial and tyrannical, right? This comes right after the big purges, right, that are responsible for incarceration and killing of hundreds, thousands, or sometimes millions of people, depending how you count the casualties and how you attribute the blame, right? And then it comes to the stage of the Second World War, which ended up being the largest sort of military campaign in the history of the world. So what did we do in that particular paper? So in that particular paper, we obtained a data set on about 12 million Red Army soldiers. We obtained their individual records, and we built a big database that allowed us to understand both where these soldiers are originating from in terms of Russia, the locality in which they are born. Then we, using the records of political terror in Russia during the 1930s, we calculated how much repression was there in the locality in which those soldiers were born. And then from their military records, we were able to determine what was the wartime outcome, individual level outcome of those soldiers that served in the Red Army. In other words, did they die on the battlefield or not? Did they become prisoners of war? Did they desert? Did they surrender? Right? Did they receive medal for personal initiative on a battlefield, et cetera, et cetera? So the question we asked was, did soldiers that come from places with a high level of repression behave differently on the battlefield than soldiers that came from places with lower level of repression during Stalin's days? And I would summarize sort of our findings with 3 statements here. So what we found is that those Red Army soldiers that came from places with more repression were far more likely to die on the battlefield or to be injured on a battlefield. In other words, they were more likely to die while fighting, right? As opposed to, for example, surrendering, deserting, becoming POWs, etc. Right? So the probability that a soldier that comes from a highly repressed area flees the battlefield is much lower, and probability that the soldier is going to fight till the end is much higher, right? At the same time, coming from a place with high repression also meant that the soldiers were showing far less individual personal initiative on a battlefield, as far as we can judge it from their military award records. So in other words, there was a specific subset of military awards. There was a specific subset of military awards that was very clearly designated for individual effort on the battlefield. And so soldiers that came from highly repressed areas were far more likely not to receive those awards. So how do we interpret that result? So our overall conclusion is that repression creates incentives for conformity. In other words, in a war like World War II, right, where Russia is really in this very much asymmetric position vis-a-vis Germany, right? Where the death rates on a battlefield by Red Army soldiers are staggering, right? The complying with the order, right, on a battlefield is usually means that increasing the probability of death quite significantly, right? And so the soldiers had to make a decision. Do you fly the battlefield, or do you risk your death, right, while going into the battle? So what we think we find is that repression creates this sort of incentive to conform with the orders, even if those orders actually lead to a higher probability of death, right? And compliance is a very important asset on the battlefield. But at the same time, right, the fact that these soldiers show less individual initiative, it means that repression sapped that individual initiative, right? So the initiative was sapped because it was feared, right? The main component through which the military machinery, organizational machinery operated, right, was compliance, in which you actually fear to take initiative because if something goes bad, if the initiative is taken, you are fearing responsibility, right? And so that propagated at all levels of the military command. And what you end up having is the situation where many people do what they are told to do, right? Even if the orders they get are actually bad orders, right? So in aggregate, right, it leads to this sort of military effort where compliance is widespread, right? But the per unit effectiveness of that compliance is quite low. Right, so overall consequence of that, we argue in that paper, is that it actually ended up leading to a far more deadly war and far more tolerance for death, and the preference for quantity of effort in war rather than quality of effort in war. So how is this now relevant for the current war? Of course, Soviet Union is not Russia, but there is a lot of continuities in terms of military organization and in terms of the military doctrine, right? And so as we were working on this paper, and this is one of the questions that Anastasia asked us to ponder upon, which is like how what you see in terms of the current war, how does it make you think about your current research? So for us, it was quite startling sort of to observe the parallels, right? Like even though the difference is 75 years, right, the parallels are quite astounding. So for example, the preference of quantity over quality, the idea of sort of that Russia is fighting a meat grinder war, that is just throwing people into the meat grinder and sort of fine with that, it was very startling for us to sort of see that parallel in the context of that paper, and overall sort of high tolerance of death. At the same time, also political interference in the military decisions in Russia, especially in comparison to Ukraine, where it seems that even though sometimes there is some tensions between the political and military objectives, lo and behold, my observation sort of is that these things are quite separate, and generals are allowed to do what they should be allowed to do independently from the political aspect of the problem. And so that sort of hierarchical decision-making by removing initiative at both very low and the middle level is something that is far more salient in the context of the way Russia is fighting this war compared to Ukraine. So the question is sort of how do you sustain this type of military effort? And my observation, again, this is not based on the study of current Russia, I'm just making an analogy here, is that the context of very coercive environment, politically sort of repressive environment inside of Russia has a lot to do with the fact that Russia is able to fight the war the way it is fighting, by sort of preferencing quantity over quality, by having very high tolerance for death, right? So when the war started, right, And sort of with this last phase of the war started, right? And people start bringing up this idea, well, wait a minute, right? Like once the Russian soldiers are going to start coming back in body bags from Ukraine, there are going to be a massive amount of protests on Russian streets. Russia is just not going to tolerate this amount of sort of wasteful death, right? And from the vantage point of that research that we've been doing, to me, that body bag theory never sounded possible, precisely because Russia is, coercive, tyrannical state as it stands right now. It was clear to me, or at least I suspected, that the body bag theory did not work because we will not see a backlash against the body bags coming to Russia, precisely because it is a repressive authoritarian state, and only in a state like that you can sustain a military effort of this kind of ineffective nature. At the same time, I think it has implications thinking about how the war is being fought when you know that these repressive incentives undermine the sort of intrinsic military morale, right? Where you know that the soldiers are not going to fight based on their intrinsic morale. So then you have to compensate by coercion. You have to compensate by coercion on the battlefield itself, right? So we know the famous, thing about Prigozhin's sledgehammer, right? In the private military group of Wagner, right? But there are a lot of other punitive on battlefield level incentives that Russia is implementing to compensate for the lack of this individual initiative that Russian soldiers are not really showing that much. It also highlights and proposes one potential explanation as to why the behavior of Russian army and the private military groups like Wagner with the Ukrainian POWs is so cruel, because in the absence of the intrinsic motivation to fight, you have to compensate, right, by cruel methods towards POWs in order to instill sort of this force cohesiveness within the units, right? If we behave very badly with Ukrainian POWs, right, we're going to be afraid, right, that Ukrainians are going to behave very badly with Russian POWs, and so that instills a greater motivation to fight. But that motivation is not intrinsic; it's all based on this sort of incentives of fear and punishment. And finally, the observation is that I think it has implications for us to think about the length of this war and the way this war is being fought by Ukraine, but also the way Western powers are thinking about how this war should be supported. So in terms of, I think it indicates that in any case, and we already, of course, see that, there is going to be very, very long and painful grind, that Russia is going to be able to sustain a long and painful grind for one of the reasons being that it is a dictatorial state that can sustain, only that kind of state, I would argue, can sustain that kind of war. And therefore, I think what is an interesting mistake that a lot of Western analysts and policymakers are making is they look at this and they think, well, wait a minute, we see a lot of evidence that Russian soldiers lack morale, right? That this is sort of, they don't see that war as being important to fight in and of itself, right? And based on that assumption, right, they sort of think about piecemeal approach to supporting Ukraine being a correct approach because it will put Ukraine on some sort of marginal advantage over the Russian that's going to suffice. And my observation on that, well, this individual level morale is really important if you think about the military of the United States. That, in fact, is a key sort of concept in the military doctrine of the United States. You can apply it as a sort of Western European democratic states fighting, right? But it really doesn't translate very well to understanding and to explaining and to predicting Russia's battlefield performance. And so therefore, sort of, this is one of the reasons why I think sort of the piecemeal approach of supporting Ukraine with weapons has not been working as great as we would like. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. It is truly a terrifying thought to think that very recent Russian repressive practices have led to, as you mentioned, wasteful death on the battlefield. So thank you very much. And now we'll turn to our panel, last but not least, panelist, Mikhail Vinitsky, who is an associate professor at the sociology department at the National University of Kyiv Academy. my alma mater, and an adjunct professor of the Lviv Business School at Ukrainian Catholic University. He has served as advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Education and Science, and in 2019 was appointed head of the Secretariat of Ukraine's National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance. During the Revolution of Dignity, Dr. Vinitsky was a regular commentator for English language media outlets and provided analysis on current events in his Thoughts from Kyiv blog. Dr. Vinitsky's book, Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity, with a foreword by Serhiy Plokhy, was published by Ibidem Verlag in 2019 and is currently distributed by Columbia University Press. I'm going to turn the floor over to you and please welcome him.
Thanks, Nasta. I'm very pleased to be. Well, I'm not sure that I'm pleased. I'm actually a little bit overwhelmed at being forced today. Because quite frankly, I learned a great deal from the previous speakers, and I think that this is something that we're going to have a vibrant discussion after this is over as well as with the audience. So thank you very much for this. My recent research has been more theoretical than what has been presented, particularly by Emma and Alexandra. I'm trying to sort of get my head around thinking about why. Or how do we place Ukraine and the reality of Ukraine into sort of perhaps more mainstream social theory? And of course, one of the issues that we talk about is the concept of agency, right? And the concept of agency, I think, is extremely important. And this is, if I were to try to explain why the performance of the Ukrainian forces and the absolute failure of Russia in the period that I lived through in Kyiv in March or end of February, March, and into April of last year, it was very obvious to me, as it was to you, I guess, Emma, that this was not going to go anywhere. But I think for other reasons, perhaps. I mean, I obviously the issue of mobilization and what we would call learned resilience is, I think, important. But I think there's there's a little bit more to it than that. The immediate thing that was talked about in the first months of the invasion was the fact that Ukrainians are doing well because of the fact that they have high-tech weaponry and they're being faced by Soviet weapons. The answer to perhaps a little bit more sort of diaspora community analysts was, well, it's because of patriotic idealism, and clearly the Kremlin misread Ukraine. And I think that perhaps most importantly, coming out of a lot of the discourse that was coming out of the Kremlin and also out of various political and academic circles here in North America, the vision of Ukraine as a corrupt society was wrong. And I think that's I think perhaps one of the major things that for us as regional scholars, I think is important. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's important for Ukrainian studies to be perhaps a little bit more situated in a little bit more mainstream social theory. So what I tried to do is I tried to look at this idea of organizational structure. As someone that is a sociologist, an organizational sociologist, and I also deal a lot with business school stuff and organizational behavior, I look at how people organize themselves. And there's a very obvious distinction between the way the Russians organize themselves and the way I personally experienced the way Ukrainians were fighting in the Kyiv region. The Russians came in as a standard, very hierarchical, top-down army, as Turas just mentioned, one that obviously commanders have a lot of tolerance for death rates, and you follow orders, and that's all there is to it. What I experienced in Kyiv was much more similar to hunting rather than fighting. You would, groups of 25 men with guns would get together and sort of say, well, there's some Russians over there, let's go find them. And the orders were rather amorphous and that sort of thing. We call that kind of structure, I've been accused lately of inventing a word. I didn't actually invent it. The word is heterarchy. And the idea being that we contrast hierarchy, which is a bit, I guess, a traditional industrial era way of organizing, to the idea of post-industrial structures, which are sort of networks of teams. It doesn't mean that we don't have hierarchy in those teams, but the teams will be much flatter. In other words, it's not a completely network kind of structure. Network structures are completely flat. We're still talking about smaller hierarchies, but the issue is that it's a kind of team of teams. And these teams of teams have common commitments, shared values, and most importantly, excellent communications between them. And I think that this is something that we've seen in the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian armed forces generally, is that communications have been absolutely key. I hate to say it, but thank you to Elon Musk in one case, but not only. I think it's just in terms of what we saw before Starlink even was deployed en masse in Ukraine. The idea of communication being extremely important was certainly there. And this is not something that's new, quite frankly. General McChrystal has a book called Team of Teams, where he's writing quite theoretically about the concept. Sort of this would be the way that the United States should be fighting. Well, it turns out that this came out just before the Russian invasion, and it turns out that the Ukrainians are fighting that way. What I think is also important is that this is not something that's just limited to military issues. So we have a book by Moses Naim about the end of power. In other words, that this shift from industrial to post-industrial organization also means a shift in the way that we define leadership, the way that we define power structures, and generally the way we organize companies, boardrooms, governments, and that sort of thing. And this is, I think, what Alexandra was talking about, the decentralization, the effect of decentralization on resilience is, I think, something that's actually very important. And we're seeing it not just in local government and local administration, but we're actually seeing it in the way that Ukrainians are fighting the war. So I come at this as a little bit of perhaps a romantic sociologist and say, well, there's this theory by Pierre Bourdieu about habitus, and maybe there's something about Ukrainians that goes back historically, to Cossacks, and we see it. Those of us that know a little bit of history of the First World War, about Makhno. I love to tell this story to my American friends. There's Makhno, the guy that you see in your top right hand corner, was a guy that organized an army. Listen to this carefully. An army of 100,000 men under the flag of anarchy. Okay, so I mean, and that's something that mostly we don't really understand how that's possible, right? Under the flag of anarchy, 100,000 men. But after the main issues that were resolved, they all went home, and that's sort of a very typical Ukrainian reaction. I think Maidans are all about that. Protest movements are all about that. You do what you need to do. You organize, and then you go home. But nevertheless, it's something that we're seeing also in the Ukrainian volunteer battalions immediately after the Maidan protests. We see this in the Maidan itself, in the structures of the Maidan. It's very much about a sort of a team of teams, hierarchy kind of concept. And what I think is most interesting is that we also see this in the IT sector. In other words, it's not something that's limited to protest movements. It's not something that's limited to fighting wars. It's also becoming a way in which successful Ukrainian companies are organizing themselves. And so I come to a question of whether this is something that is, as a sociologist, I will never say that this is ingrained in genes, obviously. This is something that is learned, but the question is it learned, as Emma would say, through protest movements over the last 30 years? Or is it something that perhaps is a little bit more fundamental, as Bourdieu would have us talk about habitus, that is something that perhaps is a disposition that has a little bit more historical roots? I don't have answers to it. But I will say that the social structure of Ukraine's armed forces seems to be a kind of a secret sauce. Interestingly enough, there was a book that came out completely sort of a peripheral book that talks about herding cats, a primer for programmers who lead programmers. It was translated into Ukrainian and it became a bestseller, which indicates that perhaps there might be something here, right? Because it's something that, again, peripheral, but becomes a bestseller later on. So Ukrainians seem to have a habitus that the world kind of needs. And perhaps, as a little bit of romantic here, I see a little bit of analogy to Weber's thesis on the roots of industrial society being sort of an ethic that was specific to Dutch Protestants. Perhaps this is something that Ukrainians today are not just showing on the battlefield, but they're also showing in the way that they're organizing local governments, the way that they're organizing their companies, the way that they're organizing many things. This idea of heterarchy as an idealistic and diffused agency, and perhaps a little bit anarchic, maybe it's something that is, in fact, I guess, the world needs this, right? Perhaps it's something that might be an example. In other words, the frontier, if we want to take a sort of a world systems theory analogy, the frontier is providing a little bit of an example to the civilizational core. But that perhaps is a little bit too much. The point is that hierarchic structures do require new institutions and new approaches to leadership and new collective decision making. And technology can facilitate the spread of new practices. But I think it's important for us to understand that these things need to be further analyzed. And here I will bring up something about that was said by Alexandra about the idea that that this may lead to a new social contract. And I'm skeptical of the idea of social contract, because I think social contract is about hierarchies. It's about someone being higher and someone being lower, and you create a contract between sort of two different types of power levels. And I think it must be, the concept here is much more horizontal, not completely horizontal again, but nevertheless. And the other thing I did want to say is that I actually do want to sort of acknowledge and shout out a little bit to my PhD student. His name is Artem Serdyuk, who has done some work recently on the idea of how Ukrainians are sort of grassroots agency creating these hierarchic structures. And he's finding that, in fact, it's not something that's completely unique to Ukrainians, because when we look at, there's a thing at the University of Delaware called the Disaster Research Center, where they do actually research on how people react to earthquakes, wildfires, hurricanes, these types of disasters. And it turns out that they're very Ukrainian about it. In other words, they're very sort of, grassroots agency becomes very important, cooperative leadership, distributed leadership, and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, so what I'm trying to say is that I think that we need to perhaps look at the uniqueness of the Ukrainian reaction and the resilience of Ukraine, but taper it with a little bit of a grain of salt, because I think it's perhaps unique, but perhaps not so unique, or perhaps not as unique as we Ukrainians would like to see it. Let's put it that way. Nevertheless, I will end my presentation with a little bit of a romantic piece by Yaroslav Hrydzak, who I believe is one of the three top historians that we Ukrainians have, that we can, as Ukrainians, we can perhaps be proud of. I mean, Plochy, Snyder, and Hrydzak. Ukrainian society is structured horizontally. Indeed, this is how our army is fighting as well. Recently, I overheard a discussion between two military experts. They were discussing what would have happened if, during the first days of the invasion, Zelensky had been killed by a Russian recon unit. And their conclusion was that this would have been a huge strategy, but it would not have lessened Ukrainians' chances of victory, because every mayor, every local leader, and I would add here, every company leader, every organizational leader acts like a little president. In other words, making decisions without waiting for orders from above. And the Ukrainian army is different from the Russian army because of this idea of initiative. And I think this is actually very good that Arturas mentioned why the Russians don't have initiative. Perhaps the fact that we have 30 years of relative freedom is an example, or is an explanation for the initiative that we're seeing. The Russians have been losing a comparatively large number of generals in this war, and they need to be close to the front to make those decisions. So in our threat, the threat is existential, the case is existential, and therefore this gives rise to strong feelings of solidarity and love. Perhaps it sounds strange, but Ukraine today is a country of love. Hrydzak, like me, is a bit of a romantic. Final slide that I will end with, because we don't want to keep up too much time. One of the pieces that I wrote completely, frankly, it was one of these that took about an hour's worth of writing, and it came completely, as romanticism tends to sort of, once in a while the muse shows up. I wrote a piece in Thoughts from Kyiv in March or April, and it was this idea of Ukrainians being bees, and this went viral. So if you're a bear, sticking your claws into a beehive is a bad idea. But the idea was basically that bees defending their hive need no instructions, and each takes responsibility and therefore is very effective. And I think this is really the key to resilience that we see in Ukraine today, is this idea of heterarchy, not as opposed to fighting hierarchically. And I think that this is perhaps, I'm not sure yet, but perhaps a sign of not only the times today, but also perhaps something that foreshadows some changes, not just in Ukraine, but as the world moves to a post-industrial creative class kind of society, perhaps something that we can learn from the Ukrainian example. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panelists, for this incredibly insightful remarks. And so I would like to remind our online audience that our chat is live and you can ask your question there. And now I would like to kick off with a question from the live audience. So please go ahead.
Would any of you respond to the refugee problem and how you think that will play out and how it might respond to the research that you've done with regard to Ukraine?
I can start. I guess you mean refugees, you internally displaced people or refugees abroad? I mean, I would like to quote mayor of the town of Kopychynsk in the Ternopil region. He said, I don't see internally displaced people as a challenge or as a problem. They are our resource. And what they were doing is this town, they were actually drawing displaced businesses into their community, giving them space where they would restart their industrial production. It was a furniture factory from Kharkiv, and so that they will pay local taxes there. And here's the advantage of decentralization, because the local authorities are interested in drawing the creative and productive class into their localities. So from this perspective, it's not a problem in this way that it has to be fought with, but it just has to be. And the second point is that internally displaced people in Ukraine have been the source of their help for themselves. So there are internal displaced people councils that authorities use in order to get advice what to do with IDPs and for IDPs. So again, this collaborative or hierarchical structure, we can see it in how they face their IDP, well, the challenges that are related to IDP arrival. With the refugees, of course, if a lot of active people are leaving Ukraine, that is an economic, like an issue for the economic development. But here again, I will really quote Bogdan Kilichava is his name, the Kopychynsk mayor. He constantly says that since this is an economic resource for Ukraine, that the current support already for Ukraine has to make sure that Ukrainian cities are livable, and so that the people don't have to go abroad to do that, to search for themselves.
Hi, I have a question. It was a great panel. Thank you so much. So just one question will take time for Arturas Rosenas. Because now when you are talking about today's situation, just after Russia's authoritarian influence how soldiers fight, but do you have any thoughts about regional differentiation or from where the soldiers are coming too much? Does it make a difference other than from Northern Caucasus or Siberia or Central Russia? I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if some Russia's authoritarian.
No, I think it's clearly does matter. And I think there are several dimensions on which this regional differentiation within Russia matters. So first of all, Russia internally varies, or at least used to vary quite a lot in terms of sort of the levels of local authoritarianism, right? So, there's one thing to talk about, St. Petersburg, and the other thing is to talk about Chechnya or Dagestan, right? Sort of the history of a more oppressive type of environment, in Chechnya is far longer, let's say, than in more urban areas of Russia. And I'm sure it would be interesting to do the study, to do a breakdown, let's say, of a military behavior of individual Russian soldiers, depending on their region, let's say, of origin. We haven't done that, but this study suggests that it could align in a similar patterns, right? And I think there is a sort of a separate question to that, which I think is also interesting, is sort of the way, where does Russia draw its military recruits from, right? From which regions do most of the Russian casualties proportionally coming from, right? And I think the story over there that is emerging is quite interesting, right? That we already know from official numbers that the Russian Federation is providing, right? That the death rates vary by regions immensely, right? Like someone from Bashkiria, someone who was, drafted from Bashkiria has far larger, death rate than someone who was drafted from like Moscow, etc., right? So right, or Buryatia or any other, Yakutia, any other sort of, national region of Russia, right? And I think this is something that needs to be researched, because, we don't want to make a mistake where we sort of say, well, this is just a consequence of sort of internal ethnic discrimination within the Russian military command. It could be other factors that are driving this. Of course, these regions tend to be much more poor, much more educated. But I would like to draw on this notion that we now developed in the United States in the last couple of 4 years of structural racism, right? The fact that those places that where ethnic minorities in Russia live tend to be vastly underdeveloped and under-resourced is sort of an indication of sort of structural racism that exists in Russia, as a result of which most of the young poor men actually that are drafted in Russian military or are professional Russian military are actually coming from those places as well. So I mean, it's sort of your question has multiple dimensions that I don't think have been researched. So these are just sort of hunches that I make, again, based on the analogy of World War II.
Arthur, sorry, could you shift slightly to your left?
To my left.
Yes, there's an audience camera right behind you. So that's perfect.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yes, you mentioned, I had a question that probably concerns the reconstruction of Ukraine and the narrative we have about the conduct of the war in the past up to this point, since 2014. I wanted to quote one example, which is quoted by Fintan O'Toole in his book about the birth of modern Ireland. And he talks about the defense of Jadotville, where 155 soldiers, all Irish soldiers, are holding up a UN post, and they're defending against French and Belgian mercenaries. And they were extremely successful. The attacking party had about 1,400 casualties, and all the Irishmen survived. So that tells us that defense by its own nature is much easier. And we have seen that so far. So to what extent do you think this objective factor has been explaining the performance of Ukraine so far? What does it tell us about the future of Russia being able to hold on to the territories they've occupied so far? Thank you.
Let me try to make a stab at that, if that's all right. I think the answer is you're asking a question of sort of crystal balls, right? In other words, how do we look into the future? I don't think we have to look into the future very far away. I think that we all understand that there's a counteroffensive imminent, in which the Russian side will be the defending side. And at the moment, the Ukrainian side is fielding approximately 200 to 250,000 troops attacking. And there are 370,000 Russian troops on Ukrainian soil at the moment that will be defending. So I think we will see the effects of small group tactics, the structures that I was talking about, the patriotism and the high-tech weaponry, and whether that is enough to get to balance the imbalance in terms of numbers. I don't think that there's a specific answer to that. But you started your question with post-war, and a lot of the discussion that is actually post-war. And I did want to make a brief note to what was said about refugees and internally displaced people and that sort of thing. I think we need to be sober in that Ukraine is not going to be a country of 42, 45 million people in the near future. We're going to be significantly less. Estimates are somewhere 32 to 35, depending on how many come back. But at the end of the day, perhaps 37, 38. But there will be a significant amount of emigration from Ukraine. There already has been, and not everyone is coming back. Which actually causes some issues. And many of us that have been thinking about trying to sort of counter the Kremlin's narrative, which is very much about thinking about the past and somehow trying to recreate in a very strange and skewed way, but nevertheless, sort of this romanticized past that Putin is proposing, sort of recreation of empire. That has been countered by a very forward-looking narrative. There are many people in Ukraine that are talking about post-war Ukraine, even today, which is strange when you've got 20% of your country occupied and a very unsure perspective in terms of what's going on with the counteroffensive. But nevertheless, people have started planning for a post-war Ukraine. And one of the things that is scary in that post-war Ukraine is that we simply will not have enough people for reconstruction. And the irony of it is that it is perhaps even likely that the people that will be reconstructing Ukraine may actually come from those regions of Russia that have received the largest amounts of casualties, that are not in the core of the Russian Federation today, but we're looking at Buryatia, we're looking at, in other words, minorities of the Russian Federation may actually be, strangely enough, in high demand in Ukraine as far as the reconstruction. And obviously that time horizon is 3, 4, 5 years after whatever peace comes. But nevertheless, it's looking at things forward, I think, is as useful because sometimes you see some of the dangers and risks that you can perhaps avoid today.
I just wanted to clarify that when I talk about the defendant side, I mean the side that's actually fighting on its own land.
Well, true, but the defender's advantage is not just an ethical, moral, or morale kind of advantage. It's actually a physical advantage of being dug in, and the Russians have become dug in southern Ukraine at this point. So it will be a physical advantage that we'll have to overcome.
So thanks everybody for a fascinating panel. This has been fantastic. I have a couple of questions. One for our tourists. I was wondering if you could, so the logic that you put forward, like it's based on cross-individual or cross-regional kind of evidence from Russia. I was wondering if you could put it in a larger comparative context, right? So do we see this kind of, I think that the takeaway I got from it is you get it when people are repressed generally, right? Not repressed to join the army, but repressed generally, you get armies that are much more compliant, but less creative. And that somehow, and this is where I'm having a little bit harder trying to come back, this means then that the population is much more tolerant of higher casualties in the army. So if you could walk through just like why that means it's the population, because you said this is going to disprove the body bag thesis, which to me has been a puzzle, and I'm very interested because I feel like you're giving me an explanation for this. But there are other puzzles out there, are other explanations for it. So I'd love to get a little bit of the mechanism. But then comparatively, this should suggest that in other countries that rely on repression, you see these similar sorts of military organizations. And I wonder if you guys have looked at that at all. And then for the others on the panel, these are, I feel like you've all offered these kind of longer term, the sort of bigger picture, interesting explanations for about the success of the unexpected success of the Ukrainian resistance of this invasion from a stronger foe. And the question is, I mean, I feel like there's an Occam's razor story here. Like, so my question for the rest of you is, so can your explanations explain the difference between what happened in 2014 and 2022, right? Because there's an Occam's razor story that like 2014 looks a lot like Georgia. There's a quick little invasion, there's success really quickly, then there's some frozen conflict that kind of settles in with, has to do with, with other people doing the fighting, the Russian army not really involved, not really saying they're involved. And then the Occam's razor story is that in the aftermath of that, there's 8 years, right? There is a serious effort to improve the Ukrainian military that gets made in that 8-year period, involving what we're now learning is like heavy levels of NATO training, involvement, rotating soldiers and stuff like that. And so the army that faces the invasion of 2022, and then 2022 invasion, of course, is also not nearly as limited as the first one, is a very different one. But you guys are telling stories about like things about the nature of Ukrainian society or what's been learned from sort of 30 years of protest or decentralization. So why were the things that you're talking about here not more effective in 2014? If I want to believe that they're telling me what's going on in 2022, because I forget the term, hierarchy, right? Hierarchy could come out of the Occam's razor story, right? Like you just actually build a much better military in the 8 years intervening. So, but thanks all of you for the presentation. It's fantastic.
Right. So to your question, so I think I have two answers because there were two questions. So one is it something sort of like Russia specific, right? So we didn't study anything else, but there is some research that is more sort of cross-national, looks at the higher level, macro level sort of patterns. And there does seem to be a correlation between, let's call it military effectiveness and the regime type, and it favors democracy in a sense that the casualty rates are better for democracies in terms of, do you win similar type of battle with similar type of casualties if you're democracy versus autocracy? So there is some advantage of being democracy in that regard, right? And then there's, of course, a lot of sort of qualitative evidence in terms of description of the military effort that is consistent with that type of reason and outside the context of the Second World War. As to your second question, like how does it explain body bag theory? So, of course, what we are talking about is that when we measure the behavior of soldiers, we just measure behavior of soldiers, but of course, the repression is also affecting the people who are not drafted in the army, who stay back home. And so when we say high tolerance for death, we don't mean some sort of intrinsic tolerance, although I think there is some psychological mechanism that could explain it. But what we mean more is extrinsic tolerance, meaning that even if I don't tolerate, even if I do not like the fact that, half of the high school graduates from my little town have been killed somewhere in the middle of Eastern Ukraine, right? Well, just sort of coming out and reacting to that in a repressive environment is quite a different undertaking. So that's the reasoning behind the phrase high tolerance. It's more like behavioral expression is equivalent to people having high tolerance.
So these are like two things that happen that are
Right.
both due to the fact that
Affecting
they're
both
repression.
populations, right?
It has this effect on behavior, but it also has this effect on protest. Or
Right.
Yes. Okay, thanks.
Can I
Yeah.
ask Josh's second question? Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important question, right? I didn't speak very much about my current research, in which I'm really interested in looking at the efficacy of Ukrainian civil society in the current context. And in particular, I'm really interested at how this is very grassroots and well networked in the way that that Mikhailo was talking about the Ukrainian military. I would argue that Ukrainian civil society and protesters and actors who are involved in the Euromaidan, they did play an important role potentially in 2014 because the Ukrainian military was in a lot weaker position in 2014, right? And if it wasn't from the volunteer battalions going from Euromaidan to the front, if it wasn't for people fundraising and finding boots and drones and all kind of different things for the soldiers in the East, then the situation in the East would have looked really, really different if it wasn't for Ukrainian civil society back then. But of course, the scenario was a little bit different. The threat potentially seemed less existential. It was a little bit more politicized and partisan, maybe, like it wasn't immediately clear to what extent this was purely coming from Russia or this was like a grassroots Ukrainian separatist movement. So I would say that the role that civil society and kind of the civilian movement played in 2014 and then how that translates into 2022, I do kind of see like a thread moving through that.
I think that if you don't mind, I'll just actually add to that. I think you're absolutely, I fully agree with everything that you've said. I'll try to perhaps answer it in. I think we have a problem when we talk about 2014 as one event. We need to separate Crimea and the Donbass. Okay, Crimea was something that happened extremely quickly. Within, what was it, 6 weeks, it had been annexed, right? Less than 6 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously, as Emma just said, at the time, the Ukrainian army could field approximately 5,000 troops against 38,000 that were just special forces just in Crimea. That's not counting everything around around the country. So I think the answer to that one is, why did the Ukrainians fail in 2014 was because there wasn't just enough time for grassroots mobilization to happen. In the Donbass, there was enough time. And this has to do with the volunteer battalions that Emma was mentioning. And this has got to do with the fact that, look, Ilovaisk, which is the battle where we first see Russian regulars on Ukrainian soil, that's August of 2014. Yeah, it ends in a massacre, but at the end of the day, the Ukrainians don't particularly do all that badly. They do badly against Russian regulars because they're not trained, etc. But it's not a complete rout. 6 months later, January and February of 2015, there's the Debaltseve, which is actually a Ukrainian success. And again, volunteer battalions facing Russian regulars. So I would simply say that, first of all, the difference between 2022 and 2014, we have time to mobilize. Mobilization takes time. 2022, we have 8 years to mobilize. Second point is, in order for success to happen on the Russian side, you have to have a certain amount of acquiescence from the population. In Crimea, there was acquiescence. In this invasion, there was no acquiescence at all. Perhaps there would have been a little bit in Kherson Oblast, and a little bit in Melitopol, but in comparison, I mean, the stupidest thing Putin ever did was going after Kyiv. That was just, I mean, sorry, but I've been using military numbers here. You don't occupy a city of 3 million people if you've got less than 300,000 troops. You need a 1-to-10 ratio, and he had 200,000 for the entire invasion. There was no way that he was going to be occupying Kyiv. So, I mean, because there was no acquiescence. Whereas in Crimea, there was.
So the hierarchy structure that you talk about, would it be correct to say we can think of this as necessary but not sufficient?
Yeah, I think it's an explanation. I think that it's extremely important when I do my, I mean, this was a short presentation, but what I'm writing about right now is actually the concept of agency, and mobilization is part of agency, grassroots mobilization is part of it, and structure. So how does agency then become, if you like, instantiated in certain structures? And the interesting thing is it's not about charismatic leadership of one person as we would think of in the literature of 100 years ago. It's about multiple and charismatic ideas, and that's what.
I wanted to just also to add to the 2 points that my colleagues have already made. I would even not see the 2014 as a failure, considering the scale. And in 2014, Russia tried to instill the same so-called People's Republic in Kharkiv and in Dnipro. And in both cities, there was a local mobilization against these efforts. And even in Dnipro, we know that one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, he even funded the volunteer battalion to fend off the Russian invasion. So this the hierarchy, as actually it was already in place back in 2014. Another thing is that to spread it takes time, and the social learning also needs the time for the practices to spread across the system. And here comes 2015 decentralization reform. That is new. So the decentralization reform has been tried to instill since, by some accounts, 2006, some 2008. There have been multiple ideas, but the real decentralization only happened in 2015, only started. And then it actually happened by maybe 2018-19, when we can say that the municipalities amalgamated voluntarily. And so the decentralization reform came onto the hierarchical social structure, but it provided the administrative structure for this to function. So again, I see here continuation rather than something that is contradictory. And I would also add, drawing on what Emma said, the civic mobilization to help the army was not only to support it with anything from boots to equipment, but also to do the military reform. And there has been so-called volunteer lending. This is where people who are completely civilians, some of them were IT, actually 2 of them were people representatives of the IT industry, some were from the banking industry, and they were instilled into the highest ranks of the Ministry of Defense as advisors in order to reform the processes. And the first process they were reforming is the procurement, because that was a big problem for the regular army in 2014, that the equipment or whatever, backpacks or other things that were not good. So with the procurement reform, that could be improved. So and that is for me, now that I heard Mikhailo's talk about hierarchy, this idea that a civic volunteer lending is installed in the Ministry of Defense, high security, and so on. Like, where did you hear of similar events? So here I'm not so familiar with other examples, but this seems to be quite unique in Ukraine.
Can I just briefly add to this? I know. So, like my sense of that is I understand the where the question is coming from, and I don't think anyone doubts it. Both military reform, NATO training, weapon provisions, and all of these things have been sort of crucial. But the war is very multifaceted, sort of very multidimensional thing. Even with a very good, not even if the best army, you can only succeed so far if you don't have, support in the society. If the economy is not working, if global government is not working well. So for me, what was really interesting in all of these presentations, right, is that in some ways I was thinking, if Putin had attended this talk, had he understood the sort of the existing predispositions of the Ukrainian society, local government, right? Also its history, if he had a correct interpretation of what Ukrainian history means for Ukrainian war effort, right? I don't think February 2022 would have happened. Like that's sort of my reasoning. So
I mean, and that was sort of the impetus for my question, right? Because what Putin attended was the annexation of Crimea and not this panel, right? So the lesson, so it's the question is like the lessons, if we think that that's the lesson he drew, that it's just be just like Georgia, just like Crimea, right? And so that was the question about the extent, that was part of motivating my question, like why is looking at what happened? And the answers have been super informative, so thanks for that.
And unfortunately, I will say that, we as social scientists have a certain element of responsibility. And I think it's sometimes painful to realize it, but we do. The literature out there on, for example, 2014 and the Maidan, I'm thinking of certain things that were published by Woodrow Wilson Center. There's certain things that were published by the name of Sakwa, Richard Sakwa, who is extremely, very, very authoritative in regional studies, post-Soviet studies, etc. I mean, it was an interpretation that was not about local agency. It was about supposedly this was a coup that was sponsored by, the West. It was about NATO expansion. It was about a Ukraine that is endemically corrupt and divided along ethno-linguistic lines. That was the image of the country up until 2022, and that's the reason that we are so surprised today, I think, why Western leaders were surprised and why Putin was surprised, because
I mean, I'll push back just a little on that because of the work Emma and Ola Onek and, these folks were doing. Like, I think there was definitely a strain of research. Now, maybe it didn't have the prominence of the Woodrow Wilson Centers, but that the linguistic differences were becoming overcome and the emergence of this civic identity from all the work that was being done by this particular group. So, I mean, there was a diversity.
Sure.
Of things. I'll stop talking now.
I'm perhaps overgeneralizing, but nevertheless, I think that there is an issue that we, many people got Ukraine wrong.
Okay, on this happy note, our time is up, and I would like to say thank you to our amazing panelists. That was a great pleasure to have all of you, and I think all of us enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.